Okay, welcome to another episode of Bagpipe. My name is Jing. I'm the CEO and founder of Bukit Vista. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that is very, very fundamental, and it's one of the first questions. Should I buy freehold or leasehold? This is a very important topic. It's one of the first decisions that many investors consider in their process of becoming an investor. Let's talk about the freehold structure and the leasehold structure first. Freehold is the idea that you can purchase the property under your own name. So the land and building will be owned under your own particular title. I'm not a lawyer and by no means a notary, or I shouldn't even be really giving legal consultation, but this is the generics of it. Freehold in Indonesia can only be owned through a nominee structure, which means that an Indonesian person has to hold the actual titles. Holding and owning the actual land, well, doesn't that make this particular investment a bit dangerous? And the answer is yes, it could be. So what exactly is done to mitigate this particular risk? Typically, when you have a freehold structure, what you'll see is that the nominee whom you choose will be essentially restricted in some ways to sign power of attorney to you for the rights to sell, the rights to lease, and the rights to use all the underlying property. Also, the nominee will sign typically a mortgage agreement that will protect your property investment value so that they don't get cheeky and perhaps take the property and use it for collateral for a loan at a bank. A leasehold is a bit different. A leasehold is just a standard lease contract that you might see is very straightforward. You typically will lease land, and they lease it for anywhere from 20 to 30 years. During that lease period, you're free to build something on it, and then at the end of the lease period, you would be returning that land back to the owner, or if there's an option to renew, then you can renew. From a business perspective, what's the difference? A lot of our investors coming from developed nations, let's say they're coming from Singapore, coming from Australia, they're coming from the United States, or they're coming from anywhere where they're in a primary residential market. The primary residential market means that you are coming from an area where people live and work in that particular location. Bali, for the foreign property investment market, is a secondary, or in some case a tertiary residential market. In fact, most of the owners of properties here don't actually live in Bali. This particular situation creates a different circumstance for the valuation of a freehold property. How? So in a primary residential market, you can expect that one location that has developed an industrial base to continue growing over time. More people go there, more jobs are there, so more companies move there to have access to the workers. So as such, then the land in that particular area starts going up in value. But in Bali, what you have is a very different circumstance on the freehold side. What you have is what would call seasonality trends over months and over years. These are seasonal. These come across the entire span of a year. You have some days that are highly desired by visitors, and those are going to be peak season, and some days that are less desirable, these are low season. But the seasonality trend in terms of a long cycle looks like this. Does your region actually compete well with other regions around the island? Well, when tourism first started, at least when I first started in Bali, that was almost 2 decades ago, the primary points were in Kuta. 20 years later, Kuta is not that great of a place. Most people will speak not very well of Kuta. The valuation of properties there has gone very low. And in fact, the entire community there is not, let's say, nearly as desirable as other areas of Bali. So what has happened? Essentially, one location has actually fallen in value, not because of any particular lack of growth or anything, but it has seasonality. There's a new area now, Seminyak, Canggu, that have just become much more popular. So you see land prices and building prices go up in the new areas rather than the old areas. The second thing with the freehold behaving unexpectedly different in Bali is this idea of design. So let's say you have a property that's been designed 20 years ago. Well, chances are it's going to look like it was designed 20 years ago, which means that newer designs that have higher appeal, more sexiness, more coverage on Instagram, will start getting the majority of viewers to actually want to have those kinds of experience. This presents an interesting turnaround to freehold properties, actually, because freehold properties then are locked into older designs. Your design has high risk of falling out of fashion. So freehold does experience things a little bit differently. But let's go with the leasehold model. Pros of the leasehold model is that fundamentally you're starting off with something that is far more affordable. The capital involved in essentially building and leasing land could be something about maybe 30% or even 20% of what the freehold option will go for. Let's say you're starting a restaurant, you're leasing the land and not buying the land for your restaurant, which allows you to have a stronger cash flow in a short amount of time. So then the idea is, okay, what's the cons of a leasehold? Well, the cons of a leasehold are fairly obvious. The con of a leasehold is that you don't own the underlying land, and so eventually you will see a asset that's depreciating in value. Okay, so the leasehold obviously has pros and cons too as well, but what's the benefit? So when I first started working in Bali, this was around the 2010s, what I saw was the majority of the market was very, very inclined to buy freehold properties. These were investors coming as investment bankers from usually Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, and they wanted to come to Bali and they wanted to own a holiday home here. So what quickly happened was actually this, because there was not a lot of data at the time, and prices were being reported to whatever anybody wanted to be reporting them, there was no information transparency. A land that was sold for, let's say, 400 million, eventually got reported and rumored to be sold for 800 million, almost double that. There was also, I would say, a weak real estate agency culture, whereby none of the real estate agents would actually value properties correctly before listing them. So there was a constant price escalation. What happened was that the market eventually was destroyed that way. Everything was too expensive, the amount of liquidity fell, and the freehold market went very, very quiet in Bali for almost a decade. An innovation happened sometime around the 2013s, 2014s, and this was the idea of really figuring out how to create a popular leasehold structure. Now, what you had was, essentially it started here in Bingen. A group of developers got together. They got together with a local notary, and they popularized the leasehold effect. What immediately happened was now a newly built property was immediately ready to be rented out on a platform like Airbnb. Now, the other benefit was that for marketers like ourselves was that on a traditional property on freehold, there was hesitancy for some owners to be flexible on pricing. But on a leasehold property, since you're essentially losing value every day that you're unoccupied, the owners were a lot more flexible and open-minded about changing their prices. So why did this model work? Why did the leasehold model actually become successful? The previous property market, people were transacting a property. They're transacting a building and a land. But on a leasehold model, the real key insight, and this is the one thing you should take away from this video, is that the model switched from a property model to a time model. On a leasehold, the actual way to think of it is that you are wholesale buying time for a particular piece of land that you can put a villa on or multiple apartments on. So you're essentially getting the cost of that land down to tens of dollars a day, whereas your guest might be paying up to a few hundred. So now you're actually not seeing the land as land. Now you're seeing the land as an opportunity for a guest experience for time, and you're getting a very good wholesale discount on that time, and that's the difference. And now leasehold is pretty much the dominant way that most investors will find their way to Bali and purchase something for holiday rentals. Which one is right for you? Should you buy freehold? Should you buy leasehold? I guess it really depends on who you are as an investor. If you're an investor that is more into thinking about, let's say, legacy, you want an estate for your family to be able to enjoy through multiple generations, the freehold option might be more tedious, more expensive, but more legacy rewarding in the long term. If you're a business investor and you're thinking more of this as, let's say, how can I get the fastest return on investment? How can I get the greatest yield for my investment? Then there's no really contest to it. The leasehold model is far better and stronger. But why is that? Why can't a freehold model do as well as a leasehold model? On a freehold model, as I've said before, your initial costs are much higher, and the reliability of you being able to see capital appreciation on a piece of land or design is relatively unproven. Whereas on the leasehold, although not everybody wins, I see that for the most part, the essential difference between the price of the lease and the price at which you can rent for day is on the order of 20 to 30 fold. For even if you're a terrible business person, you make a lot of bad mistakes, there is still a very high opportunity to make profit in this particular leasehold model, as long as you are thinking of how to properly manage and actually market and get occupancy in your particular property. So that's a brief explanation, or as brief as I could make it, with my 2 decades of experience here in Bali in terms of just making the decision between whether or not you choose for the freehold or the leasehold model, and hopefully that's been helpful. This is Jing again from Bagpipe. We're part of the Bali Business Review, and if you've enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below. We'd love to hear your questions. We are always thinking of new ways to answer questions from avid property investors, so maybe I'll be the next person to answer your question. Goodbye.